I talk for a second?
Excursion into
Coaching. All right, here we are talking about coaching. I'm Yannick, as always, if you know this one. I'm here with Dylan Emerick-Brown. Dylan, welcome so much. Thank you for making time for this.
Thank you for having me.
This will be a different kind of introduction because I was just musing on whether preparation is actually, if you ask better questions if you're prepared, or if you ask better questions if you're not prepared. And maybe on an unconscious level, I was taking that to heart, but I'm going to be traveling for a month and was so much on the plate. I've literally not looked at anything that you've done. I kind of forgot how we connected, but I remember I immediately got drawn by your love for the narrative approach and by your love for writing. And very quickly we found ourselves in a conversation where I thought, like, coaches can benefit so much from learning more about narratives. And you developed an approach to working with people with that. You're a writer yourself. You read literature to your daughter every night. I remember that one. And I think there's so much value in understanding what narratives are, the immense value and the immense position, the role they take in our lives, and how we might, one, work with that in coaching, but also how coaches can, I hate the word leverage that, but like be more aware of the narratives that they're creating, right? The stories that we tell. I often told people to tell more stories. And at some point, I made an effort to become a better storyteller because it's a skill that we can learn, right? There's so much rich stories that we encounter as part of our coaching work. I mean, just the humanness of it all. And I think it deserves, these stories, like, they deserve to be out there because they're not the kind of Hollywood polished stories, but they're real stories of real people. And they're always so inspiring on so many levels. So today I figured Dylan and I, let's just sit together and talk about stories and narratives and how we might work with that in coaching, but also how coaches might use some of that as a marketing tool.
Yeah. And it's a topic that's very close to my heart. I used to be a high school English teacher many years ago. And when people typically think of narratives, I find that they usually associate it with like a creative writing workshop. So they might say something like, "Oh, well, I'm not that good with narratives," or "I'm not a good storyteller." And the irony is they're telling a story as they say that. The story in their head is they're not a good storyteller. So to clarify, when we're talking about narratives, you and me, it's really just the unconscious stories that we tell ourselves. They're inward in terms of what we tell ourselves about ourselves, but also outward in terms of what we tell ourselves about the people around us, the situations we're in, and it's constant. And so it's a good thing that it's unconscious. Typically, we'd probably lose our minds if we were hyper aware of all of these narratives. But when it comes to coaching, it's an interesting way of actively listening to the client in a way that is very, very present in an analytical way, not just on a cognitive level, but on an emotional level, because a good story has to make sense logistically, but it also has to tap into something emotionally. And when we're really listening to our client, we're focused on what they're saying, how they're saying it, body language, tone, all of these things make up that narrative. And like you were saying, it's not polished, it's not Hollywood, but that's the point, because when people speak to us, like you and I are speaking right now, off script, just off the cuff, people speak from their heart. They are unedited. And that's the beauty, that's the value, because there are plenty of times I've asked someone, "Have you realized you've used this word 6 times in the past minute?" They're like,
They
"No."
hadn't.
Yeah. So and I'm very careful not to take the analysis so far as to interpret, but just to reflect back to say, like, you've used this word, 6 times in the past minute. What are your thoughts about that? Or what does this word mean to you? Or it's interesting that you chose this word and it doesn't quite seem to fit the context. What are your thoughts on that? And it's just reflecting that language back, or even the body language when
Yeah.
they start to slump when they talk about this person or something like that.
Yeah, there's a story in how you carry your body, right?
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the major takeaways I got from exploring narrative work is that, like, somebody doesn't have to tell me an engaging story with a story arc and describe the emotions very accurately and really paint a picture for me and, you know, go through this, the hero's journey or something. And I don't have to even be particularly engaged or excited to listen to their story, but that in itself is a story. There's a narrative in there. Somebody giving me, I think I mentioned that when we first connected, right? I had a consultation and I specifically asked them, right, so tell me your story, which I sometimes do in consultations because I'm curious to hear their story.
Hmm.
And that person gave me a factual bullet pointed list of what's been happening in their life. Grew up there, went to uni there, studied this, got married, had 2 kids, moved to Brownsville. I don't know. I'm making all of this up, by the way,
Hmm.
but you know, that wasn't a story in my mind, but I realized that's a story because the way that this person is processing the world and the way that this person is choosing to share who they are is coming through this bullet pointed factual list. So that's just interesting in itself. So,
Yeah.
yes, there's more and less engaging ways to tell a story, but
Yeah.
everybody's telling a story through how they speak or how they hold their body or how they dress. There's a narrative in all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like, why does one person choose poetry as their medium of expression versus fiction? And if it's fiction, the novel versus flash fiction versus short stories. So there's so many ways of telling that story. And for some people, it is very bullet point. It's very, some might say, surface level. But even then, it's interesting what bullet points they choose to share and which bullet points they withhold. So there may be a stark notice in, you talked about your schooling and your professional background and all this, but you didn't mention anything about family or whatever it may be. So yeah, the mode that they choose in of itself is a very
Yeah.
interesting thing to focus on.
I love that question for myself as a coach. That what are you not telling me about question?
Hmm.
Which parts of the story are you leaving out? And I'm not sure at any point if there's significance to you not telling me about family or significant relationships in your life. I might just ask, but
Hmm.
I think the parts of the story that we choose to highlight and the parts of our story that we choose to hide or, blur or change
Hmm.
or portray in a particular way or just not say anything about. I mean, most of our client story we will never learn,
Hmm.
because there's just not enough time to tell it.
Yeah, there's this one really interesting question I like to ask people sometimes to get at that missing puzzle piece. And it's a question I learned as an interview skill, but I apply it to coaching because it works. And it's, what question do you think I should be asking you right now?
Oh, yeah, I love that.
And it just catches them off guard every time. No one expects that question, but then it gets them thinking about their thinking and what may be relevant or what would I like to be asked right now. And it's just fascinating. It,
It's great. I remember when I saw that question first time, and I'm like, that's just the most annoying question. I mean, as a client, if I were to be on the receiving end and the coach who's supposed to be the expert in asking questions, ask me what I wanted to ask, but that's your job. And then every time I tried it, like not every time, There was a few occasions where just like, that's not a helpful question.
Mhm.
Fair, you know. But like most of the time, I was really surprised at what came out of this, because as a coach, the client knows best what question they need to ask,
Mhm.
and what a brilliant question to ask. Definitely always worth a try.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is so much of the storytelling experience comes down to also who you're telling the story to. Like my daughter,
Mm,
who is 7, she is getting into singing and she's going to be taking this singing musical camp this summer. And she has to do like a little audition video. And she's always really self conscious about, okay, I'm going to sing to daddy, or I'm going to sing to mommy, or I don't want to sing to grandma and grandpa, because different people have different dynamics. And
mhm,
so when it comes to asking those kinds of questions, that to maybe an average person may be an annoying question, it goes back to that relationship you build with the client so that they are comfortable sharing their story, whether their story is in bullet points or just this fully emotional monologue, whatever it is. You want to create that space where they feel comfortable expressing themselves however they want. So when you do ask those off guard questions, they
mhm.
don't feel as uncomfortable. It's giving them permission to really explore it in a safe, non judgmental way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm tempted to ask you that question now, but actually, what I wanted to do for the past 10 minutes or so is, let's take a few steps back and just kind of explore a bit where you are speaking from, right? It's quite related actually to what you're saying, because often it depends who we're talking to. And I,
Mhm.
I noticed, as much as I don't want this to matter, but I think it matters to a lot of people to hear where your perspective developed, how it developed. So, in a way, I'm asking you, can you tell us your story, right?
Yeah.
And I just love to get to know you a little bit, see how all of this emerged for you.
Yeah. So I live in Florida here in the United States, and I started
Well, there's a
my,
narrative.
yeah, there's a narrative. I could easily go off topic on that one. But I grew up here and I've lived in different places, and I really started my professional career in college. I wanted to be a writer or an editor, so I got my bachelor's degree in creative writing, which is a very useful degree. And then I became an English teacher. And so I surrounded myself with literature and literary analysis and writing, and I loved it. And then years and years later, uh, I created the high school literary magazine, and we interviewed all sorts of writers about the writing process. How do they get around writer's block? Just really delving into that internal piece of it that's usually hidden. We interviewed Pulitzer Prize winners and Maya Angelou and all of these people. So I just immersed myself in the process of writing a story and editing a story. And then when I became a coach, it just felt natural when I was listening to people to listen to them through this lens. I had been doing this for so long, anyways. And then I started to think about coaching as sort of a writer's workshop for someone's life. And we all see each other as the main character of our own story, right? We're
Hmm.
all the protagonists. And we go through life, and when good things happen, it's a great plot twist. And when you get the flat tire or something, it's a negative plot twist. And everyone else are characters in our story. Like I'm a character in your story, but it's reversed for me. And
Hmm.
so when you think about your life in that context, like a story, like a narrative with characters, I started to realize, well, I'm not just the main character of my story, I'm also the author of it to a great extent. That this person I've cast as the villain in my story, they don't wake up every morning saying, how am I going to piss off Dylan? they're the main character of their story. And so I thought, what if I treat them differently? What if I rewrite them in my narrative? It's not going to change necessarily directly how they behave, but if I see somebody differently, I'll naturally treat them differently. And if I treat them differently, then they very well may pick up on that and treat me differently. And it becomes this self fulfilling prophecy, as so many things are that we discover in coaching. So much of it is self fulfilling prophecy.
Could
So,
you give us an example of where that
yeah.
worked in your life?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. One of my favorite examples um, was so for me personally, uh, back even when I was a teacher, I started thinking about things this way. And there was another teacher who she just wanted the tenure, didn't really care too much about what she did or how she did it and the students. And it drove me insane that here's someone in my department. I was the department chair. She does what I do, and she's so bad at it and doesn't care, doesn't want to improve. And I saw this person in a very negative light, and she saw me in a negative light. I don't know exactly how she saw me, but it wasn't positive. And once I realized, okay, well, she probably has different priorities, different motives, different ways of looking at things. So let me be a little bit more empathetic, a little bit more curious. And I started having conversations with her that I didn't have before, learned a little bit more about her. And in my mind, without being intentional with it, I rewrote her as a different type of character in my
Mm.
story. And it changed our relationship. But a really stark example, if you want one, is I was coaching this young woman who was Brazilian and living in Canada during the pandemic, and she was a sports writer, and she was feeling homesick because she couldn't go back home, and she was very connected to family. Her visa was going to run out soon. Her career wasn't taking off. She was just in a really tough spot. And she was really focused one day on her editors, and she just wouldn't stop harping on them. And I knew right then and there they played a really prominent role in her narrative. And I asked her, if you were
How
to,
did you know?
how did I know that they played a role? Oh,
That they played such a prominent role?
she was talking about them constantly,
Right.
almost
Okay.
as though they were in the room with us. They, just
Right.
it was
Yeah.
totally top of mind, and she didn't realize how much energy and time she was expending on them. She thought she was just giving me a quick update, uh, but it was just on and on and on. And I asked her, if you were to assign them a role, what would it be? And she thought about it and she said, gatekeepers. And I thought that was really
Mm.
interesting. And I asked her, how does that feel? Like, what's the connotation with that? And she said, it's very restricting. They decide what of my writing gets out to the world. They decide the fate of my career, what gets published, what doesn't. And then I asked her one of those obnoxious questions, but we had a good relationship, which was, how do you think they see themselves in
Mm.
their story? And her initial reaction was, how would I know? And I said, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, it's a hypothetical. How do you think they see themselves? And then she thought about it for a minute and she said, well, I think that they see themselves as people with years and years, decades of experience, that they've learned a lot over this time and they've earned their place where they are as editors. And they probably have a lot to share, a lot of wisdom and experience to share with someone like me. And so then I asked her, so what role would you want them to play in your
Mm.
narrative? And then she said, mentor. And
Mm.
I asked her, what would she need to do and how would it feel if this was the role that they had? And she said, well, it would feel amazing. It would feel fulfilling, and I would just have to listen less critically and more open mindedly. And so she started doing that, treating them like mentors. And she started taking their advice differently, hearing what they had to say through different ears, and making certain changes to her writing style and things like that. And then suddenly she was getting published every week. Boom, 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 boom. And it was transformational, all because she shifted their role in her narrative. And ever since then I'm like, oh yeah, this is fascinating.
Yeah, that's brilliant. We have so much power in the way that we construct narratives. It reminds me a bit of TA, transactional analysis, where once we relate to somebody differently, something else comes back.
Hmm.
It's such a resonant space. I mean, occasionally, I'm sure you ask the editor, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm a gatekeeper. I keep shit writers out of the air."
Exactly.
So it might align,
Yeah.
but most of the time, there's a profound difference that you can make just by changing your mindset, because that's quite stoic, right? That's all we can really influence, how we relate to other people. We cannot control how they're gonna relate back to us, but what happens is that it happens, because it's really awkward if somebody's relating to you, if somebody uh is not going choosing not to be your enemy. It's very difficult to keep hating on them,
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
um
And one of the interesting things you said there is the gatekeeper versus the mentor, right? They're both right. Depending on your perspective, there's evidence to suggest both. So the question that always gets proposed to the clients at the end is, but which one is best serving you? Which one do you
mhm.
want? Because yeah, we could sit here and talk about they are gatekeepers, and we could list all the ways that they're gatekeepers. And we could do the same about mentors. It's not about right or wrong. It's about which narrative is the one you want to live into.
Yeah, and a gatekeeper can keep you out of somewhere, a place that you desire, but it can also be protective, because if they let you go to that place in your current form, then it might not work out well for you.
Right.
So there might be really benevolent gatekeepers. They're
Exactly.
not all keeping people out because they don't want them there.
Yeah. And there was something you said earlier on I want to go back to about when you were talking about the bullet pointed client and how sometimes those stories aren't very interesting. And it's true. I mean, we as coaches, we're not we're not paid to find every client interesting and every story enthralling and all of that. And I find uh, that a lot of coaches put pressure on themselves to really, really get in there and almost taking being present to like an extreme. And there's an analogy I use from my teaching days. I'm a huge fan of James Joyce. And
James Joyce. I'm not familiar with James Joyce.
oh yeah, the Irish writer of Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake. I
Oh,
mean,
right.
that in of itself is a totally different rabbit hole I could go down. But James Joyce, interestingly, his daughter Lucia had schizophrenia and was treated for just a few months by Carl Jung. And Carl Jung was familiar with Joyce's work. And he made the observation of Joyce and his daughter that they're both like two divers descending to the bottom of a river. One's swimming, the other one's drowning. And I love that metaphor because when I'm with a client and I'm listening to their story, and sometimes they get very emotional, sometimes they cry. I don't want to put the pressure on myself to necessarily inauthentically feel what they're feeling and to cry as well. Uh, Basically, I see myself as that diver. I will dive with you, but I won't necessarily drown with you. And
Mm.
so, I don't have to necessarily love your story or be enthralled by it, but I will listen intently. And I even have next to my desk, as a reminder of that analogy, a little diver figure that
Ah,
I found. And it's just sitting here as a reminder of that.
Scuba Steve.
Scuba Steve.
Yeah, like I want to pick you up on that. We hear a story from a client. When I hear a really boring, disengaging story from a client, that's usually when I find myself really curious. And it's not that the story is taking me in necessarily, but I get super curious how that person developed to be the kind of person that tells their story in this way.
Hmm.
Right? Either because I often have a feeling that the story that you're telling me is not doing justice to the amazingness that's sitting in front of me. And I don't mean that in a very kind of Californian American stereotypical way. Um, but I think every person is quite fascinating.
Hmm.
I mean, has that person just not learned to communicate in that way? How did that come? What have they experienced that they're maybe so protected about giving away information about themselves, or what's happened in their life that they, missing half of the vocabulary that other people seem to have. So it's not, I think with coaches, curiosity kind of comes with the profession. And I think if you're sitting in front of a person and you're just really, really bored and you have nothing that you're curious about, that's really interesting projection. There's really interesting transference going on. I think there's something that, because I would think that a coach would be interested in this person in front of them. So whenever I get bored, I get really curious. That's what I'm saying.
And that's the key there, is to get curious and not judgmental, because it's
Uh-huh.
very easy to sit there and go, what am I doing wrong? Why don't I care about this story? What does this say about me? What does this say about the person? Instead of just being curious. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe you're distracted. Maybe it's their tone. They're just super monotone, or you're not the kind of person who connects with the bullet point list type story, whatever it happens to be. But that curiosity is key. And that's one of the things that I feel there's an interesting balance that I can't quite pinpoint, but sometimes because I've spoken with and coached with plenty of other coaches, and sometimes they're not curious enough and they go into sort of an analysis mode, an
Mm.
interpretation, and they start making those judgments pretty quickly about the other person. And then sometimes I almost get the sense, if there is such a thing, that they're overly curious to the point where it is okay to make an observation. Not everything out of your mouth has to be a question, uh, and to kind of point something out that you're picking up on, because it is valid. I mean, there have been times when I've politely interrupted a client and said, like, look, just for the sake of variety, uh, I don't have a question, but I just need to say, like, where is this like, this is going nowhere. Whatever it is, and just sort of helping that person get off the tracks a little bit, because remember, like, one of the great values of having a coach is they're an external thought disruptor.
Mm.
And if we let them stay on their tracks, whatever that story is, and just tell us the same story they've been rolling around in their heads just constantly, we're not really helping them. I mean,
Mm.
sometimes it's good to let them get it off their chest and to really listen, but at a certain point, we need to just kind of gently push them off the track a little, just to see, how does it feel in this discomfort? Or when I ask you this question, or ask you, and what's your role in this? And I
Yeah, I
mean
wanted
that.
to. Yeah, I wanted to ask you that because you have a choice of letting the story unfold, and there's a good argument to just let that happen, because as soon as we inquire about something, when you started telling your story, I had a million questions. I could have stopped you at any moment and go deeper into this. Tell me more about that. Oh, how does that work? And I think especially in coaching, there's value in just letting that person unfold themselves without much influence from you. And I think that's really valuable. But then, as you say, right, coaches also have a role of disrupting your story or getting curious or inviting someone to go deeper or picking something up that's we intuit to be significant, and I think that's really helpful. So how do you make
Mm.
those decisions, whether to invite someone to go deeper on a certain area, or whether to disrupt something, or offer a reframe, or offer a summary, or to just hold space?
Yeah. So to go back to the literary analysis analogy, I see myself as a coach sort of like an editor, where I'm not the one writing the story. The client sitting across from me is. They're simply reading me the story. And just like an editor will, I mean, typically an editor doesn't have the author read the story to them, but
That would be quite something.
that would be something. But I'm listening to the person, and I'm using my personal professional judgment, my curiosity, and I'm letting the story unfold. But then there comes a point when, uh, and it's hard to put my finger down on it. There comes a point when, if there's a question that's just screaming at me, I can, politely just interrupt and ask the question that's just screaming at me. If it's just a nag, I kind of let it go, maybe write it down so I don't forget and keep listening. But if it keeps coming up, then that's my gut, my intuition saying this person needs to think about this, because otherwise they can just tell a friend. They can, tell their dog, whatever it is. I mean, they don't need me to just tell their story and not say anything. But what I say and when I say it, it's very contextual. I guess that's why it's hard to pinpoint exactly, because it very much depends on the context, what I think in my completely arbitrary opinion is worth pointing out. And that goes to the whole dynamic of coaching, right? It's a relationship. Some some clients just aren't going to resonate with me in my style, my personality, and I'm not going to necessarily resonate with some clients. It's very much a relationship. But I think when you've got that strong relationship, you can trust your gut a lot more confidently, and they can trust, if they're being interrupted, it must be for a reason. And I'm vulnerable enough to acknowledge to the client sometimes, like, look, this is just an observation. It may mean absolutely nothing, but what do you think about
Mm.
this? And so, yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me how often you just need to make an observation. You don't actually need to ask a question.
Hmm.
You've mentioned this word several times. I don't usually I don't need to ask, what are your thoughts on this? It's just something that resonates. And then, or let the experience I'm having as I'm listening to your story. I was on Coaching Uncaged on a different podcast. I talked to Robin Showett, and he works very much with himself as an instrument. If he gets terribly bored and he knows that's not my stuff, you know, he would share. he would tell that person, "Oh, I'm getting terribly bored here." And if you have the relationship in place and the rapport, this person is on your side. Like, that's something that somebody will resonate with. Maybe it's uncomfortable,
Hmm.
but for Robin, it doesn't even feel courageous anymore. It's just that's what I have access to. I don't have access to your experience. I only have access to my experience.
Hmm.
So how somebody's resonating with your story, I mean, that's going to bring some stuff out, especially for someone who has a really dull storytelling style.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's not the first time they get that sense, but maybe it's the first time that somebody actually acknowledges it or speaks it out loud, what their experience is.
Yeah. I've coached like healthcare billers, and sometimes a healthcare biller will feel the necessity to go into the detail of the context of their story, and they're telling me about the codes, and I just have to stop them and say, like, I could not be less interested in that. I don't need that kind of information, that the code was missing a 7 or what. No. That's not what this is. And I think, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, eventually I've established a rapport with my client to where there are times when I can just give them a look or just a gesture, something, and they know, something I said Dylan's thinking about, something I said I should be thinking about here. And
Yeah,
and they
I've been
just
there, yeah.
and then they just go,
Oh, you
"Oh,
just
I
made a
know what you're
face.
going to say.
Oh.
Okay. Oh, I see it now." And I don't even have to say it. Okay, all right, yeah,
Well,
you're
you did
right.
say it,
Yeah,
just not with words, right?
exactly. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I should take responsibility for it. Okay, I get it. And so you sort of establish that rapport over time where, and again, from my experience interviewing all of these acclaimed writers over the years, back before I was a coach, I learned so much about that writer-editor relationship. And
Hmm.
there are writers who have the same editor for decades, and they just develop a rapport that's so similar to a coach and his or her client. And
Huh.
it's that the writer almost has them on their shoulder while they're writing and thinking, "Oh, he's not going to like this metaphor," or whatever it is. And they establish this groove, where the discussion is so fluid. And I think that's a good description of the best coaching sessions, where it's it's very conversational, it's very relaxed, and it goes to some uncomfortable places, but you feel safe because you're there with that other person, and you know that they've got your back, they've got your best interests at heart, they've got that perspective that's going to shine a light on something you hadn't thought about, and it's comforting, um,
Hmm.
being the flashlight in the fog. And so, uh, I really like that mentality of just being the editor of those unconscious narratives. The story is still theirs. They still decide what to do. I'm just
Yeah.
asking them, you know, does it really make sense? Does it really add value to the story for this person to be doing this? Or is this really what you want? Or is this just kind of on the surface what people expect? Ultimately, they make the decision. It's their
Yeah.
story. But
This seems to
yeah.
be in contrast to what the protagonist did a couple of weeks ago or said
Hmm.
a couple of weeks ago. This behavior seems to be misaligned with some of the core values of the protagonist. There are those things an editor might point out for
Hmm.
you to consider. Um, Fascinating. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. But then also, I haven't had that many touch points with editing, particularly good editing. I was a bit disappointed by some of the editing I received. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting because my relationship with editing has been a very difficult one because I'm so attached to what I write. And it's not just, I always say I hate the editing process, but I think what I should have said is I hate a bad editing process because I remember I was working with a business partner of mine. I've been writing these nuggets for a very long time. Many people probably know. Um, I've always been just writing them. And then at some point, somebody was helping me with editing them. And it was very difficult at first because I was very attached to what I've written and I didn't want to change anything. I was very particular about how I phrased certain things. And they needed to be quite specific, quite like that's exactly what I meant. Don't change the words because that's what I meant. That's what it is. I don't care if it's, correct necessarily, or if it would be more engaging, or if it's too many words. I use too many words. I use that many words with a purpose, so letting yourself get challenged on what you're writing and what you mean. And a good editor will be curious about what you mean rather than just imposing what they know onto your writing. So it's super interesting to see different agendas and aims and purposes at play. But I think a good editor, if you look at this from a coaching perspective, an editor with a coaching lens, they will be curious other than anything else, because in the end, you own your story, and that editor is not a gatekeeper. That editor is not contracted by someone else to make sure that you align with whoever the editor works for. This is your coach editor, and they're just going to be curious to make sure that this is aligned and coherent, and that you're going to write the best possible story for yourself.
And I remember a few weeks ago you posted on LinkedIn the experiment with the gorilla walking in the background, right? I want you or anyone watching this to like go back a minute or two and listen to what you just said, but through the lens of coaching, not writing and editing. And it'll be identical.
Yeah.
Everything you said about writing and editing could just as easily be applied to someone's unconscious narrative and editing or coaching. And so, like a good example, you mentioned twice the word attached, right? You're attached to your story. Everyone is. Everyone's attached to their narrative. That's why they need a coach, because they're too attached. And it's hard to get that outside perspective. And sometimes I tell people, just as it is physically impossible for you to tickle yourself, because your brain has like a kill switch, an unconscious kill switch. You can't do it. You cannot physically tickle yourself. Your brain also will not allow you to explore your own unconscious narratives objectively. You can't. You're too attached. And that was that word you used, and it's so true. And that's why coaches can be so valuable. But also, to your point, it's not the editing process, it's the bad editing that you don't like. And so it's not the coaching, it's bad coaching that can turn this sideways really pretty fast. So if you've got a curious coach who is empathetic and listening carefully and asking you questions about your narrative to get you thinking about it differently, and challenging, like the example you gave about, does this behavior align with these core values, and letting them decide how to take the story forward. That's the best kind of coach, and that's the best kind of editor.
Yeah, and there's a level of discomfort in it, in good editing. And I've certainly experienced that with Martin, my business partner back then. And it in the beginning, it felt like a fight, because we were both quite big personalities and quite, we think things through, we know our stuff. And every time we went through this fight, it got better. It was better writing for it afterwards. And I think it could have, because of how we were and what we both lived and our stories, there was probably more fighting than there needed to be. But when that comes from a position of curiosity, it can be very uncomfortable, right? So if somebody's just curious about, what are you saying there? And I noticed that sometimes I'm like, oh, but it's obvious, isn't it? But that person is on my side. So if he's asking me, it's not obvious. It's certainly not as obvious as I think. So I think curiosity is the most elegant way of challenging someone. And if the rapport is in place and the contracting is in place, if the space has been created well, that person, that your coach is on your side, because your coach is most likely not someone hired by a third party to work in their interest. Maybe sometimes in organizational coaching that can play into it, that there's an external, it's not external because it's part of the coaching, but there's a third agenda, there's a third party in the room. But
Hmm.
when we take one-to-one coaching, you're hiring this coach is there, who's he or she or they are on your side. So that discomfort that people get when somebody's curious about something or something doesn't quite make sense, getting invited to or having to explain yourself or getting invited to look at something a little closer or challenge something, um, that can be a difficult moment. And I think that's why the level of discomfort is always something I contract for in coaching and in supervision. Hopefully it's going to be a bit uncomfortable, because that just means that you're breaking out of your sedimented stories, and you're able to move and create something that's essentially going to be better if you allow it.
Yeah, that point about curiosity and discomfort. I mean, the discomfort is essential, and I love that you contract for it, because you really should go into the coaching relationship expecting discomfort.
Mhm.
It isn't a potential side effect of coaching. It should be an intentional goal that we push you a little outside of your comfort zone, just so that you can explore things that you didn't know before. And I mean, it's really interesting how that discomfort is so growth oriented. I mean, there are times when I will talk to someone about their unconscious saboteurs. If you're familiar with positive intelligence, the way that your brain naturally reacts to stressors, to discomfort. Or I could be talking to someone about imposter syndrome, or any number of things. The one thing all of these things have in common is discomfort. And what you resist persists. And so when people resist the discomfort, or they try to push away, fight the imposter syndrome, or fight the natural reaction to a stressor, or whatever it is, they are just going to persist in it. But all discomfort means, at its most foundational level, is that you are in the unknown. That's it. Whether it's good or bad are just labels we assign to them arbitrarily. There is no good or bad. It's just discomfort. When the check engine light comes on in my car, I think it's a bad moment. My car mechanic thinks it's a good moment. Good or bad is irrelevant. But when you're experiencing discomfort, that's the place where growth happens. Growth won't happen when you're too comfortable, because
Yeah.
that's where it's just infertile soil. So I find that a lot of times people come to coaching because they resist the discomfort. And then a lot of times I see myself, my role is pretty much to kind of hold their hand in the discomfort, not to not to keep them from it or to see it differently, but to just be there with them so they can see what's possible that wasn't there before. But that
Yeah.
discomfort is so necessary. And to your point about the stories and you being attached to them, people don't like the discomfort. They like the attachment to the known. But that's also where the value of a good editor or a good coach comes into play.
Yeah, one of my favorite TED Talks is by a guy called Bill Ekstrom, and it's called something like "Why Comfort's Gonna Kill You" or something. And he says growth happens in a state of discomfort. And for a very long time, I'm like, that's it, right? Growth always happens in a state of discomfort, and it makes a lot of sense, right? When we grow physically, it hurts. Like
Mhm.
and when we go through a growth spurt, especially when we're growing fast, right? Growth can happen without discomfort necessarily. Most of the time, we don't notice that we're growing physically, right? But when we go through a growth spurt when we're younger, like it hurts, there's pain. And when we stretch our minds to that extent, there's discomfort. That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
I do think there's some learning processes that are quite fluid and organic, and it just feels right. So I've kind of moved away from that extreme position. But when it's fast, I mean, of course, stretching, it's in the word, right? So when we look
Mhm.
at muscles, it happens the same way. So I think that kind of coaching is definitely gonna involve some discomfort. So that's why I always contract for it.
Yeah, there you mentioned, I think at the very beginning of this, when we are talking about you're introducing narratives, you mentioned the hero's journey.
Mm.
And there's this great quote by Joseph Campbell, and he talks about, I'm going to butcher the quote, so I'm just gonna like try to paraphrase it, but basically, uh, you create your own path in the act of walking it. If you're following someone else's path, then it's not your path by definition,
Mm.
right? And I really took that to heart, the quote that I can't remember, but the analogy there, because when we follow our own path, there is inevitably a discomfort there because there's no guidebook to it. There's
Mhm.
no recipe, there's no instructions to how to do it because we're in the unknown. And that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's genuinely your path. You're creating it in the very act of living it. And
Mm.
so, a lot of times, if you read books by acclaimed CEOs or celebrities or people who write memoirs at the end of their lives reflecting back, there almost seems to be this sense of inevitability. Like, of course, they were destined to become, Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or whoever they are. But if they're really being honest, some memoirs are really good about it. There was nothing inevitable about it. They were freaking out the whole time. Looking back, it looks great. Like a one recommendation would be Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. He's the founder of Nike. It's a great book. And he's so honest and vulnerable in how anxiety riddled his career was until it became Nike, right? It's so easy to be like, wow, you mentioned shoe brand, Nike comes up like that. But for so much of his career, it was on the verge of falling apart. And so it's all about how do you cope with and navigate the
Mm.
complexity of that uncertainty, of that discomfort, as opposed to let it rule you.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficulties in this day and age is that there's all of these stories out there, and there's all of these blueprints, and all of these people, gurus, life coaches, parents, systems, advertising that tell you we know you, and this is how you need to go. And naturally, we all first walk in other people's footsteps. We're not born walking our own path. I mean, I've got a toddler, so I know in many ways we do walk our own path quite early on, quite naturally. But we tend to follow our parents because they are, our primary caregivers, because they show us the way and it's safe in their path. I like snowboarding a lot. So, when you walk through snow and it's deep, it's the easiest to walk in somebody else's footsteps, because that's the least effort
Hmm.
and it's the safest way of going. But then inevitably, as people, we're going to have to go off course. Otherwise, it's not going to feel like ours. And
Hmm.
culturally, it's quite interesting because there's different perspectives on this, right? I think in the West, we idolize individualism a lot more. Walking your own path. I think there's a lot more pride. I noticed, for example, when I went to Japan, there's a lot more pride in walking your father's footsteps.
Hmm.
And it's not all about, oh, I need to make my mark on the world, I need to do things my way, and this overemphasis on authenticity in a way that it must be something new, it must be groundbreaking, must challenge the status quo. So I find that really interesting that in the world where we have all of these blueprints and all this access to other people's experiences and all these how-to videos on YouTube, and in 2 nanoseconds we have how somebody else in exactly my situation did this problem that I'm facing currently. And
Hmm.
yet they are all individual stories, and we are all different people. There's I've worked with so many coaches trying to build a business, right? Seems to be the number one pain for coaches. How do I actually make this a sustainable practice that I could live off? Because I love coaching, but the business side of things is really difficult. Well, there's a million different ways to do that, but you keep hearing these stories that, oh no, you need to address people's pains and you need to offer solution to a well-defined problem. And, you need to do it through advertising. No, you need to be on a particular social media platform. No, you need to do more storytelling. No, you need to really get away from all of this digital crap and really connect with people in person, build relationships. Less is more. No, more is less. More is more. There's so many of this. So I think it's nauseating how many stories there are and how many stories there can be to follow, how many solutions are already on the table. Like navigating that and finding your own path in it. In a way, it's easier than ever before in history, but in a way, it's also harder than ever before in history.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and I love the word nauseating because I get constantly on different feeds, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever I am, whatever algorithm that's following me and mapping me is constantly bombarding me with, if you want to make six figures as a coach, if you want to do this, if you want to do, here's what you do, here's what you do. And look, all I have to say to that is there's an ass for every seat out there. Somebody is trying to make money off of you. And yes, there are some great pieces of advice, but ultimately, there's no one path for success. And I've always found, and this goes to another point I want to make off something you said, I found that the most authentic, genuine, fulfilling way to make coaching my career has been relationships, period. It's about creating relationships. And I'm somewhat introverted by nature. I hate mixers and networking and things like that. But when I look back and think about all of my clients, all of the people and organizations I've worked with, it's because I formed genuine relationships with those people. So any advice really other than forming genuine relationships is almost bullshit. But to the point of you being a parent, and I'm a parent, I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. I totally get it. And I love in coaching using parenting as an analogy because if the client's also a parent, like they get it immediately. There's so much crossover between being a parent and being a manager. I mean, it's really humorous. But to your point about like the autonomy and the way that like toddlers are going to follow their own path, they're going to create their own path regardless. Not to get kind of dark and sad, but if that toddler had no parent, they would still forge their own path, but out of necessity, right? And there would be a lot of baggage attached to that. But when that toddler has a loving, caring, attentive parent, that parent is essentially creating the safe space for that toddler to create their own path.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, that's what we do
coaches
as
do.
coaches.
Yeah.
Exactly. Is we want you to create your own path, but you also need the safety to do that. And that's what we provide in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and sometimes you just need a shoulder to cry on and come back and said, I tried and I fell on my butt and it's painful. It didn't work out and I'm super sad about it. And somebody not trying to just fix it for you. Many parents do that, right? They try to fix it for them. And I think sometimes it's important, but oftentimes probably better to just hold space for someone to go through the motions. And
Yeah, and I mean, and I'm sure you've either encountered this or you will as a father, But there have been plenty of times my 7-year-old daughter has, in one way or another, said, like, I failed at this, right? I lost at this. And there are times, and I'm sure when she becomes a teenager, she's going to hate this, but I'll ask her, what does it mean to fail? Or what does it mean to lose at this game? If you and I are playing crazy eights, one of us is going to lose. You went into the game knowing there's going to be a loser. So just because it was you this round, what does that mean to you? And
You stop coaching
just
me,
kind of,
Dad.
yeah, she's not at that age yet where she's going to say, I know she will, because my dad was a coach too. And when I was a teenager, I very much resisted that. But I'm trying to get as much in early on as I can. But yeah, it's creating that safe space to explore, like, well, what does it really mean to you? What does it really matter? What are your values? Because at the end of the day, and again, it's another parenting, coaching kind of analogy here. What I want from my kids is, like, my goal as a parent isn't for them to be happy. That's up to them. My goal is for them to be independent so that they can create their own happiness.
Mm.
And it's very similar with coaching. My job isn't to make my client feel better by the end of the session, where they come in depressed and upset and they leave, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. It's usually a byproduct, and that's great when it happens, but my job is to just be there, be present,
And help them to make
and
sense of things.
help them to make sense of it,
And
like
then,
an editor, like a father, whatever.
yeah, and I mean, what does it mean is one question. What do you want it to mean? Right? And you asked that in
Mhm,
a similar way earlier when it was about what the other person,
mhm,
what do you think this other person is or represents, or what's their motivation? What do you think they think is their motivation? And
mhm,
what do you want this to be? And what sense do you want to make of this? What a
mhm.
simple reframe, but what a profound reframe of the question. Because it
And how
means,
often do we ask that
yeah,
to
because
ourselves?
it invites us to consider the possibility that we have a say in the matter of what this means. And this goes back to this idea of authoring your story. And that's just a
Yeah.
very profound shift in perspective for a lot of people. That's why it's so powerful to be met and encountered, spend some time with someone who holds these perspectives, because from that perspective, we ask questions differently. We might not ask, what does it mean? We might ask, what do you want it to mean, with this
Mhm.
reauthoring perspective? And for us, it might seem like a normal question, but for our clients, it's not a normal question at all. That's why
No.
I'm always amazed how me or anybody who I'm supervising, they ask a question that just kind of comes out because it's a question that they would ask. And then the client sits there and they're like, oh my God, I never considered that. Oh, that's such a good question. I'm like, really? How could you not ask yourself that question? Obviously, I'm usually
Yeah.
not saying that at that point. But
And usually when I ask a question, it when I get that, it's kind of flipped around. A lot of times I'll ask a question and they'll say, "Huh, that's a really good question. I don't know." Almost as though that's an excuse. And again, part of my job as a coach is to hold them like, "No, no, no. That is a good question. That's not an excuse not to answer it. I'll sit and wait. We got another 45 minutes. I'll wait." But that's the point of coaching, is that, yeah, it's an uncomfortable question, or it's a question you haven't asked yourself before, but that's what creates value. If I just asked you questions you already knew the answer to, then what's the point of me?
yeah.
But a lot of times, we want to get those really tough questions across. And when we think about the narratives and the way through this perspective of looking at the narratives in coaching, it all comes down to autonomy. That a lot of times, even though we're the ones holding the pen, we let other characters write our story for
Hmm.
us. Uh, there's this really great book. It's a bit meta and weird, by Flann O'Brien, and the book is called At Swim Two Birds. And in the book, the main character is a struggling writer who's writing about an author whose characters come to life and they hate the books that he's writing about them. So when he sleeps, they kind of uh, seek revenge on him. So it's somewhat hard to follow. But the interesting thing is, at the end of the book, slight spoiler alert, uh, one of the characters uses a Waterman fountain pen with a 14 karat gold nib and starts writing the story that starts taking place for the author getting revenge. And just as I've got that little diver guy, I have from eBay, it doesn't work, a Waterman fountain pen with a 14 karat gold nib.
Huh.
Again, as like a physical reminder that to ask ourselves, and myself included, who's writing this part of my story? The fact that this has made me so upset, or that I feel like I have to do this, I'm feeling a pressure to do this. Who's really writing my story? And it's a question we don't ask ourselves. Are we reacting to someone else? Are we doing what we feel someone else wants us to do? And maybe that's not a bad thing, but we should explore, is this someone whose advice I want to take anyways? Is this someone who should be holding the pen right now? Or should I, wrench the
Yeah.
pen from their hand and be like, no, that's not what's going to happen here.
Oh,
So
yeah. And
yeah.
how tempting is it to want to write the story or intervene in the story, especially when we're parents, but also when we're coaches. I think every coach has felt the urge to want to intervene and help this person out by rewriting that story in a little bit differently so that they have an easier time.
But you can rewrite your story. That's the thing, is like, there are plenty of times my daughter or son will have a temper tantrum, and I would love to just take an eraser and be like, nope, not having that right now. But the part that's within my control is, how do I view that temper tantrum? How do I could see it as just, here's this spoiled kid who's not getting what they want, and this is driving me crazy. Or I could sit there and think, if I'm just taking it to some extreme off the top of my head, one day my daughter's going to be 18, 19 years old and leave the house, go off to college. And I will literally miss the days when she's sitting here crying in her room, and her presence is here. And it literally brings tears to my eyes while she's having like a little tantrum, thinking, what a beautiful moment I want to hold on to. Like, how weird is that?
Yeah.
Like a minute ago, it's like, oh my gosh, I just want to rip what's left of my hair out. And now I'm thinking, I just want to cherish her presence here.
Wow, that's really
another
beautiful.
moment longer. Yeah. And so, the fallacy that we sometimes fall into is wanting to change the story or their story. But it's really about changing my story.
Yeah, but we also do have a lot of power in changing or influencing other people's story, right? Parenting example might be, I can just distract my daughter out of, at the moment, I can still very much distract her out of all sorts of emotional states. It's like, oh, shiny red ball. Oh, and all of a sudden it's forgotten. So I've just taken it away from her and I've kind of steered it. Coaches often intentionally and consciously offer, for example, a reframe. Oh, my boss is such a terrible tyrant. I hear they have a very particular style, and I don't know, whatever you want to reframe that as, the gatekeeper. We can change somebody's story, and we can ask them good questions so that they take responsibility for reauthoring their story. But there's a lot of coaches out there who very actively intervene. They offer ways that this could be rewritten, and with the best intentions. I don't think it's as helpful as it could be, because I think it's generally most helpful if people own their story and they can credit themselves for having written the story. But I'm sure there's many editors out there, professional editors in writing, who do give their take on the story. And how many stories are now different to what the writer actually intended it. I think it was
Yeah.
was it Robert Rodriguez who I think he said that he's Tarantino's buddy did From Dusk Till Dawn together,
Hmm.
and he said there's 3 movies. There's the movie you envision, then there's the movie that you write. I know there's the movie that you write, there's the movie that you shoot, and then there's the movie that you edit, and there tend to be 3 different movies, right? Because it changes through all of these processes. So existentially, the theme of responsibility is huge, right? And at the same time, there's many coaches who lean into having an influential party. NLP coaches, they pace and lead all the time, right? And often clients want to be taken by the hand and shown the light and how to do things. Coach me through this. There's so many people who don't want to take responsibility for their own story.
Right. And that's to my point about there's an ass for every seat out there. I mean, there are editors out there who will tell you as an author, everything you wrote is perfect. I wouldn't change a single word. And then there are editors out there who would change everything and basically rewrite your whole book for you. And look, there are great coaches out there. There are coaches who are really half-assed consultants. And yeah, it's super pleasant to think I can hire this person. They're going to take my hand and walk me through this and, guide me into the light. And it's very tempting to become that person when someone is looking at you as the one with all the answers.
Especially if you think you know stuff and you have some answers.
Exactly. And I've had clients who have said, well, what should I do?
Yeah.
And there was one client who I remember distinctly. He asked me that question a number of times over a couple of sessions. And I just stopped the session and I said, look, I want to be very clear and remind you of what our coaching relationship is here, because it's not this. I'm not going to tell you what you should do here. It's super tempting. I have my thoughts. There are things I think you should do, but that's not my role here. And it's not your role either. And so to the existential point, and I know that's like right up your alley, the existentialism, me as a coach, if you were my client, I am helping you to shift your perspective and to see things in a different way so that you take autonomy of your story and can rewrite it. And then as a result of you rewriting your story, the way that you see different people in your life as now rewritten characters, and you, as a result of the shift in perspective, you behave differently around them. They may in turn pick up on that change in behavior and behave differently towards you. So like there is a trickling effect of the influence here. But I always caution people like, look, you can't control that those editors are going to suddenly become your mentor, that you're going to change them. It's a likely and common and hoped for result, but the goal here at the end of the day, the most agile, universal, useful practice here is for you to learn how to be a better editor of your own stories, to catch yourself and realize this isn't me, this isn't natural, this isn't where I want to go, and to catch yourself and to kind of explore it and rewrite it in a way that you are writing the story you want to live into.
Yeah.
And it will usually have side effects as a result of that and changing other people's behavior, but you can't go into it with the expectation, like my intent of rewriting my story is to change you. It's like, that's an exercise in futility.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you acknowledge, right? I stopped judging coaches for the kind of coaching that they do as long as you're able to communicate more or less what it is that you do and what it is that you're willing and not willing to do. If somebody can sit down with you and say, "Hey, this is my style, this is my approach, this is what we might be doing," even though we might not know what's going to be happening, give people a bit of a framework of how you work, what your intentions are, where you're coming from, and if somebody says yes on that basis, great. So give tons of advice. Yeah, absolutely. Knock yourself out. Sometimes that might just be the most helpful thing for someone. Right. Sometimes we need someone to take us by the hand and guide us towards the light because we just can't do it ourselves, and it would be really helpful. I'm a big fan of walking your own path, but I acknowledge that there's times when either people don't want that, or it might just not be what somebody needs right now. So just there's a seat. There's an ass for every seat. He said. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it absolutely, and I do a fair share of I wouldn't necessarily call it advising, but sharing some observations that some coaches I'm sure would say, "Don't say that. Just be quiet. Just ask questions." And it's like, well, I feel like what they need right now is, well, here's an option. Here's something you could do. And then what do you think about that? We could go down that road. But at the end of the day, I think it's about, like you were saying, being honest, being authentic about this is my style, this is what I do, why I do it, how I do it. And at the end of the day, I do think it's kind of like the movie Inception, where the growth, the change is going to be more sustainable if they were the ones who came up with it. If they were the ones who had the epiphany, like, oh my God, yes, this is what makes sense. This is the connection, whatever it is. And sometimes, depending on the context, it's not necessary for them to have that epiphany. I could just say, it's interesting that, this and this seem to have a connection or whatever it is. It's not that big of a deal. But, sometimes it's all context. It's all context. Did we lose connection? Hey, you there?
Hey, yes, lost you for a moment.
Hey, where'd you lose me? I can kind of go back.
It's funny that you mentioned Inception, because my first thought when you mentioned Inception was there's so many coaches that, with best intentions, but quite consciously, would try to plant an idea that is their idea in somebody's mind and then have them think that it was the client's idea so that they can own it. And I had a coach, I remember this coach was like, he was really proud of himself as well. He's like, oh yeah, no, that's definitely what I do. And that's my service to the client, is to give them my idea, and then they can own it so they can, praise themselves afterwards. And I'm like,
that was not the intent. I was using that analogy, but yeah. The reason I chose that analogy is because it really comes down to, like, if they're the ones who have that epiphany, if they're the ones who make the connection, then it's more sustainable. It's more authentic. They've anchored it to something within them that already exists. Like when we learn something new, but the part of the learning process that makes it stick is called synthesizing. It's when you take the new thing and you connect it to something that already exists. And that's very much a process that I want them to go through. And yes, there are coaches who plant the seeds for them and ask guiding questions that lead them to a certain conclusion. But yeah, I think it all, the original point there is, I think there's a balance, and it goes down to ethics and morality and professionalism as a coach, and my values, that there are times when I will, I guess you could say, give advice that's not really putting my coaching hat on, but I'm very transparent about that. I'll say, like, I'm going to take my coaching hat off here and teach you a time management skill, a time management device that you can use. It's not coaching, but it's what I think you could
Yeah.
use in the moment. Or someone with ADD, here are some accommodations you can do to help with your ADD in terms of breaking up that big goal into smaller objectives. It's not coaching, but it's what you may need in this moment. But as long as I'm transparent about it, then I think I'm doing fine. But when it comes to coaching the narrative, we have to be careful that remembering it's their
Yeah, and with the
story.
big stories, I mean, these are things I don't want to take responsibility for, right? Because it's great if something goes
Mm.
well and you can credit yourself. If something goes wrong, more difficult to credit yourself. But if I advised you, or I incepted some seed, some idea, and made you think it was yours, and then it doesn't work out, and that person blames themselves, I'm like, that's a lot of responsibility. I don't want that kind of responsibility for other people's lives, even if they want to give it to me.
Mhm.
But that's my existential lens. But hey, listen, I'm having the time in mind. I'd
Yeah,
love to switch up the pace a little bit, because I'd love to move
sure.
into storytelling as part of coaches marketing. When I say part of coaches marketing, I mean the way that we
Mhm.
connect with other people, which is essentially what marketing is about.
Mhm.
I notice an association. I have a reaction when I say the word marketing or the word sales. I'm still like, ugh, because there's so much bad marketing and sales out there, which is just
Yeah.
manipulative and trying to control the narrative, right? And creating something, going into people's pain points and then exploiting that. So we're not talking about that. What I'm talking about is genuinely creating the opportunity for a connection, so that a door opens and
Mhm.
somebody would want to have a conversation with you, because in those conversations relationships can be born, and in those relationships there's helping potential. So storytelling is
Yeah.
such a profound way of marketing, of inviting those kind of connections, that we've always been sitting around the fire telling stories. That's how we transmit knowledge, that's how we connect. I mean, it's such a natural thing, and yet so many people are not very good at telling a story in a way that it it connects and it resonates. And I know you need to tell different stories to different people in different ways. You need to speak their language, and there might be Spanish, German, Japanese, Hindu, for starters. But when we speak the same language, we still need to speak the same language, right? People appreciate storytelling in different ways. There might be a person who would want the bullet point list, right? I for the
Mhm.
coaching lab, I like to lead with features. And I have this strong sense in me
Mhm.
that I just need to tell people what it is, and then they will want to buy it. And then I talk to some people, they're like, no, you cannot do that. You need to tell a whole story, and you need to, make an emotional connection. And I'm like, really? I mean, yes, I see that. And I'm sure for many people that works. But, different people
Mhm.
appreciate different stories. So with all of this on the table, I wonder if you've got some advice
Yeah.
for coaches who are desperate to make those kind of connections, whether that's
Yeah.
how to tell a story or how to tell better stories. um, I'll let you run with where you think what you
Yeah.
think might be valuable for people listening to this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of marketers, if any are listening to this, who are going to hate me. But I mean, the real thing is it's about telling your story. And you used a really good analogy about opening a door. And I want to just kind of focus on that because a lot of it, I mean, that's a great analogy. If you open a door, it's an invitation for people to come in. And you want to create an inviting door for the kinds of people you want to come in. I think too often in marketing, people just try to market to the masses. Just what is a story that's going to connect with the most people, right? And how do I target this audience and this audience and this audience? And I'm like, oh my God. So I just think about, you know what? What is a story I feel really excites me in in a really short, brief snapshot encapsulates why I do what I do. And that's the story I tell. And if it resonates with you, then you're the person that will naturally come through that door. And if it doesn't, I don't want you to come through that door anyways, because you're going to walk, otherwise you're going to walk through, take a look around, like people who window shop, they'll come in, look around and walk out. That's not appealing to me, to waste, because otherwise you end up wasting a lot of time having conversations with people who you probably shouldn't be having conversations with to begin with. It's about telling a genuine story. And so I most recently, it's on my website, the story that I really love is that during the pandemic, I was coaching an ER nurse, and she was telling me that she had difficulty with this one patient who was dying of COVID. And she knew he was going to die. He was on a ventilator, he was going down. But this individual was one of those anti-vax rally organizers. And in her mind, she was thinking, good, you get what you get, right? You deserve this because you were spreading a deadly lie during this global pandemic, and it's poetic justice. But she knew this isn't who she is. This isn't why she became a nurse. And she was battling with this. This wasn't her genuine self, but she couldn't shake that feeling. And through the coaching, she realized she became less attached, and she started to see that individual less as an anti-vax rally organizer and more as a husband, a father, a son, someone who is going to leave this world very soon. And through a few coaching sessions, she was able to reconnect with her core values, and she was able to help that man's family make peace with his passing. And at the end of it, when he died, she cried. And the big revelation wasn't simply that she was crying over a patient who had passed away, but it was almost, I wouldn't say tears of joy, but tears of this was a moment she never thought possible a few weeks ago. She never thought she could feel enough empathy for this person to cry, to feel something at his passing. And it meant to her that she, through one of the most challenging moments of her life, was able to hold on to her authentic self and core values. And so when I tell that story, whether it's verbally on LinkedIn, on my website, if that story connects with you, then we'll have a conversation. Then you might be the kind of person who wants to work with me. And if it doesn't, piss off. There's plenty of other coaches out there, right? But that's who I am. That's why I do what I do. And so when it comes to storytelling and marketing, it's quality, not quantity. Be yourself. That the advice I would give is to be yourself and focus on, who you want in your life and why you do what you do.
Let's focus on that story a little bit. Let's zoom in a little bit, because I was really drawn into the story. There was something that we could all connect with, which is the pandemic. There's this poetic justice notion that is like drawing people in either way, regardless of what your stance or your position on that is. It's something that emotionally connects, so that immediately drew me in as well. And then there's something
story
in there that is about the effect, the result, a change, a shift, a form of transformation that releases with, again, an emotional moment, but that something was possible that you didn't think was possible just a few weeks earlier. Something has shifted in you and you clearly have grown. There's some catharsis. So I would imagine that all these elements are quite consciously in there. Is that something that comes natural to you? Are there other elements in that story that I might have missed? Because it seems carefully constructed.
It's Well, it. I mean, I did write it out one day, to put it on my website. So there was some level of construction to it, but it was all genuine. And I don't know if it's life imitating art or art imitating life, but I was thinking similar to you in your question. I was thinking, what is a story I could tell in a short amount of time that really encapsulates what I do, why I do it, and attracts the right people? And I just thought, well, what's a story from my coaching that still connects with me, that
Yeah.
makes me emotional? And because I wasn't constructing, I was just thinking, you know, what are some of the highlights of my coaching career so far? And that one stood out more than any other because it naturally had those elements in it. And then I just wrote it down. I didn't embellish or add anything. So I think to, and I mean, look, if someone makes up a story, how would anyone know? But at the end of the day, again, it goes back to quality over quantity. And if you make it up, it's not, in the end, it's not going to work out. But I think the reason that story connected with you is the reason it connected with me. And so sometimes we just try
Hmm.
too hard, and we just need to take a step back, and instead of thinking, what's the story, like you use the word construct, instead of thinking, what's the story I need to construct, what's the
Yes,
story
but
I
there's
need
a
to tell?
construction in how
And
you
there's a
tell the
difference.
story, right? Because so many people come across very powerful stories,
Sure.
but then they tell them and construct them in a way that just, takes the first
Sure.
bit, the one that connects first when there isn't a context, or, just uses words that just don't really allow the other person to feel the intensity of the emotion, or, the
Yeah, there are some basic, and again, I'm a creative writing major, so like I understand the arc of a good story, and the, like you said, the conflict in the beginning, the challenge in the middle, the resolution at the end. And so a lot of times good stories follow that thread because that's what resonates with us. So that's what we end up constructing when we write fiction. But I think if storytelling isn't your thing, still think of those moments. And I mean, look, whether or not you workshop it with someone, like, we were talking about writers and editors, workshop it with an editor. You could read an article. You don't need a book or anything on just kind of the arc of a good story. They're very archetypal. We keep talking about Joseph Campbell and things like that, just to, but really to use it just to organize the
Mm.
order of events and to make sure that you're telling the genuine story to maximize the impact. You're not making things up and embellishing or lying, but what's the best way to tell the story that has the impact? Because yeah, I could have told that story and mixed up the order of things and did a flashback, whatever, like, and really butchered it. Um, but yeah, if writing's not your thing,
Mm.
workshop it with someone you trust. And I would advise pick one person who you trust, because
Too many
otherwise there's too
perspectives.
many cooks in the kitchen. You could take, yeah, you could take Great Expectations by Charles Dickens and give that book to 100 different editors and you'll get 100 different outcomes at the end. So pick someone whose style and taste you trust and get their advice. And they may point things out like, yeah, you keep using the same word. Let's go to thesaurus.com and pick a different word to change it up. Um, and, but try to keep it somewhat in your voice. Even if you're a boring monotone person, you don't want to tell this incredible story and then someone meets you and they're like, what the hell?
Yeah, and I mean,
So you
try
want
it
to
out.
keep some
I've been
authenticity there.
really recently. I've liked to listen to stand-up comedians and their podcasts, particularly when they're not on stage doing the act, but they
Mhm.
actually talk about the process of it. It's amazing the process that the stories go through. And I saw this little clip where a comedian, I forgot who it was, but they tell the same joke, which is a story like I don't know, like 6, 7 different times over the course of 2 years, and you can see how it changes because that's why these big specials, they don't come out of nowhere. Usually they try it out with audiences all over the
Mhm.
country or sometimes internationally, and you see really big comedians bomb. Nobody laughs because they're trying out a new bit and it's just not funny yet. So when you have a story about one of your coaching clients, or maybe a coaching client you heard about, maybe something you're constructing that's just hitting the themes that many of your coaching clients go through, and you just want to create something that will do the job of resonating with someone enough to want to have a conversation with you about it, because they could see the potential. This person in this story, that could be me, even though they look different and they sound different, they have a different name, and they come from a different cultural background, but the theme, the experience
Mhm.
of their struggle and what they're longing for, that is something I resonate with. So then just go and try it out. I mean, most people, if you tell them, hey, can I tell you a story, most people say yes. People love stories. And depending on how they react, you learn quite
Mhm.
quickly which parts work and which don't.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the stand-up comedian analogy, and I love comedy, and yeah, the evolution of that joke over time. Sometimes it's over years, and the goal of the joke is to get laughter. I mean, and the goal of a story in a marketing sense is to attract. It should be to attract the right quality clients, and so I don't think that story that I told, that's not going to change over time because that story, it happened. That's the story. But as my career continues, I will have more stories. Before that, my story, like when I started coaching, I couldn't tell a coaching story. I had to tell a different story. I don't even remember what it was about why I got into coaching. And so as time evolves and our experiences grow, we can add stories to our repertoire. Again, all with that same goal of if you're the kind of person who resonates with this story,
Hmm.
let's talk. You could end up becoming one of
Yeah.
those stories, right? Part of one of those stories. And so, you know, back to that point you were saying about all the people who offer all the advice out there. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. At the end of the day, you want to focus on making a genuine connection with people and think about for yourself what are the impactful emotional moments that you think about in your coaching. And
Hmm.
then how do I tell that story in a way that is brief but also packs a punch. Maybe you just on a piece of paper, you
Yeah.
write out the highlights in chronological order, and then you've got
Yeah.
the bullet points, right? The dreaded bullet points,
Yeah.
but then you don't keep it as bullet points. You just, how do I take that bullet
Yeah.
point, make it two or three sentences, two or three sentences,
Yeah.
and then you just kind of
And
weave the story
that was one of the most helpful
together.
pieces of advice I
But
got
yeah.
from that storytelling course I've done once, which I've never finished, but it gave me a lot to figure. Yeah, go figure that one. But it was the storyboard, right? You can tell a story with like 3 images, and I think your story probably didn't have many more. Like, and
Mhm.
then you just tell the story around that image, and you don't need to remember the whole story. You just need to remember the image, which is usually quite easy to remember for people because that tends to be our go-to core thing, and then we construct a story around that image. And that's just so helpful because that just needs to be alive, and then you just describe what's happening in that scene. the storyboard. So I think that's super helpful, right? So, well, like brevity is probably my biggest challenge. I write too much whenever I edit. I add more words rather than take them away, and I'm really trying to change that and write short. My they're called nuggets. My newsletters, barely newsletters, not a good way to describe it, but like. That's what they used to be, short little nuggets, and then they grew and they grew and they grew, and I appreciated that. And now I'm trying to,
Now it's the
there's a
whole
whole
chicken.
buffet of chunky burgers. I don't know, I had lots of metaphors going. But, I'm trying to get back to the shorter I can do it, the better. And if I have little time, I write something short, and that's usually received better, especially in this day and age where everybody's fighting for your attention. I forgot who it was. Was it Charles Dickens? Somebody wrote a story in 6 words. You should probably know. Hemingway, exactly. Children's shoes,
Hemingway.
never for sale, never worn. It just packs so
Never
much
worn.
punch, so much emotion. It tells a story in just 6 words.
You know what's really funny about that one too? Like, I had the same emotional reaction when I heard that 6-word story. And then I told it to someone, and they said, I don't get it. And I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, every shoe store has children's shoes for sale, never worn.
Yeah, it's missing some
And I'm like,
context,
oh
I
my
guess.
I'm like, yeah, I guess maybe 6 words was too short, but like it's funny the different way you look at it, because you go into any shoe store and that same 6-word story applies, and it's not sad at all. But yeah, like when you take your nugget, for example, just like take that draft and highlight or embolden the parts that connect the most. What are the things that are non-negotiable, got to be in there? And then everything else cut away and just kind of see what's left. And maybe you could just stitch that bit together. Or, you know what? I really like all of these pieces. Maybe these 5 pieces are 5 different nuggets. And, whatever it is. But it's really, I get it. It's tough. Brevity is tough for me as well. I could talk and write all day, but it's really getting to the core of what packs the most punch in the shortest amount of time. And like you said, we get very attached to our stories, and sometimes we got to think about, well, it's less about intent, more about impact.
Brevity is a service to other people. If you can say it with less words, it's probably a good idea. I come from a science background, and there's a lot of psychometric questionnaires, and there's a lot of work that's going into. In positive psychology, there was a lot of stuff happening, and then it was a very fresh new science. So a lot of things got reworked, and questionnaires that used to be 80 items are now 16, because, you actually measured what we're actually measuring there. And turns out we didn't need 5 questions per category. We could do it with 1 or 2. So that's helpful, especially when stories, especially when people have such short attention spans nowadays. That's why this podcast is very long. I usually block 2.5 hours. We have a little bit less time, which pains me because now it feels we're rushing, but for that reason, I have this other subarm where with Nikki and Silvash, we try to do things in 10 to maximum 30 minutes, because most people don't bring that attention span anymore. They want things quickly. And if we can't tell a story short, that's going to be good.
And look, and look, there are plenty of times I'll look at, oh gosh, there's a 2-hour video, but I really want to watch it. So then I turn it on to 2 times speed, and everyone sounds like chipmunks. But
not anymore. We got AI now.
It really quickly. But but then my wife, she listens to podcasts all the time. She loves it. Those 1, 2 hour, 3-hour podcasts. So to each their own. But at the end of the day, brevity is certainly
it's nice when people are invested
valuable.
to the point
as we
where,
say at the end of
like,
a 2-hour
I'm
talk.
Joe Rogan from like 8, 10 years ago. I really appreciate. He was so curious, and it's just like, oh, let's sit down and have a chat, and we see what happens. Kind of what we did today. It's like, well, if we sit down and we just hang out and we
Mhm.
talk, I doubt that we run out of things to say. That made a big impression on me, and he was just so curious. Now it feels like he's quite opinionated because a lot of kind of research and opinions go into the preparation bit. That's why I was saying in the beginning, like, we ask better questions when we're prepared. That's true, but we ask better questions when we're not prepared is also true, in a different way.
Well, it's a lot like coaching. I go into a coaching session, I'll look at the notes from the last session just to reacquaint myself with where we left off, but I might have a few initial questions just following up from the last session. But in the beginning, I am a little anxious because I'm like, I have no idea where this is going. But then at the end of the session, I always feel like, wow, I love where we ended, and so does the client. And I could have never predicted that. But that's the beauty of it. Just like you don't go into a coaching session, you shouldn't, with a list of questions, and this is what we're going to do. With this podcast and other conversations, there's a real richness and value to
Yeah.
just being
Yeah,
in the
talking
moment.
of being in the moment, we do need to wrap this up soon. I do have a couple of questions that I ask all of my guests. So I frame
Yeah.
them as quick fire questions, which basically means they're quite complex questions that could get us into a long conversation, but I'm going to resist the urge to respond to your answer.
I'll
Does
keep
that
it
make
short.
sense? Yeah, well,
I'll
you
try
don't
to
have to, right? We still have some time.
brevity. Got it.
Um, first, um, can you name a couple of books or people or sources you would point people to that had an influence on your coaching, on your work? Feel free to give a bit of context, but
Probably the most. Yeah, I'd say coaching specifically. I really love the work of Marsha Reynolds. I also really love Amy Edmondson, her work on psychological safety. But I would also say, in terms of book recommendations, I love fiction as a coaching tool. I work a lot with healthcare professionals, so the work of Samuel Shem, Shem, he writes these books that one review said it's like Catcher in the Rye with stethoscopes. Is fantastic. James Joyce, Ulysses, books that go into the human experience. They can be entertaining. A lot of times I'll read nonfiction, but at the end of the day, when it comes to being present, being empathetic, being human, uh, poetry, fiction can be just as effective as a book on coaching,
Cool,
if not
thank you.
more.
If somebody asks you what the difference between coaching and therapy is, maybe in the context of how you work, it could be a general answer, but what would you tell someone?
I've got a prepackaged answer for that one because my wife is a therapist. So basically, the easiest difference is I don't diagnose and treat, whereas a therapist diagnoses and treats. My role, like I said earlier, is an external thought disruptor, and I love getting people to think about their thinking. John Dewey, the American education reformer, had a quote about that, thinking about thinking being the greatest antidote to erroneous beliefs in autopilot. So they're very similar. There's a lot of crossover, but my role is to help ask questions you haven't considered before, shift your perspective, help you become the best person you can be without
Mm.
diagnosing
Yeah,
and
makes sense.
treating, prescribing,
What do you
any of
think
that.
about regulation in the coaching profession? Is that helpful to keep people safe? Is that in the way because it's a gatekeeper for people who can't, necessarily afford expensive training programs or the hoops you need to jump through for regulation? What do you think?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've asked myself plenty of times. There are many great coaches out there who don't have a string of initials at the end of their name. There are some really poor coaches out there with half the alphabet at the end of their name. Uh, I think that there is a value to having some form of standard, I guess, if that's the right word. But ultimately, there are different coaches for different people. There are MCCs, master coaches, who I've seen, and I'm not making this up, use puppets. They'll have a puppet and use that in coaching sessions. I've witnessed it. There are coaches with a lot of certification who talk about energies and chakras and all of that. And there are coaches like me who, don't have puppets and crystals and things like that. So I think at the end of the day, and most of the time when an organization, if they ask, do you have, PCC, ACC, MCC, any of
Mm.
that, they don't even know what those initials mean. At the end of the day, I think good coaches are good coaches because they care, they professionally develop. I went through CTI training, positive intelligence training, a number of different certification courses, not because it
Mhm.
was marketable, but because I wanted to improve. I don't have a bunch of initials at the end of my name. I'm a member of the ICF, but I'm not, accredited through that. But I've taken accredited courses and all of that. So if that's something that's important to you, do it. If you're a client and that's something that's important to you, I would ask why. Not to coach before you coach, but uh, really it comes down to,
Mm.
is this the right coach for me? Uh, and that's a very personal choice and not something you can easily differentiate based on
Yeah.
courses and certifications and
Have you
things like
ever
that.
had to stop working with a client after you've already started? So not like turning someone down because they're not a good fit, but you actually started the coaching process, and then at some point you're like, we need to stop this.
Yeah, there was an individual I remember who wasn't making any progress, and some of that, was because big part of it was because they weren't doing the work in between the coaching sessions on themselves. I tell clients all the time the majority of the impact of
Mm.
coaching happens in between the sessions when you're synthesizing it, when you're practicing what you've thought about and learned. And he wasn't doing that. And I'm not blaming him as a client. I didn't think we were a good match. Whatever we were doing as a dynamic wasn't working. And
How did you
I
ask? Do you
one
remember
day
what you
asked
said?
him about that and said, uh, I think I just was very pointed about it, as is my style. I can be a bit blunt and just say, I started the session the way I always do with a follow up from the last, and I knew what he was going to say. No, I didn't do any of that and stuff. And I just asked, "What do you get out of this? And should we continue?" And we had a very pointed discussion about it. And I referred him to another coach who I know and trust and thought might be a better fit. But I know there are some coaches who I know who brag about, I've had this client for 5 years. And I'm thinking either they've got a lot of changing goals or you're a terrible coach. Why is it taking 5 years or more? And I mean, there's a financial security in keeping a client, I suppose. But at the end of the day, life's too short. I want to get out of bed and be excited about the people I'm coaching. And if it's not a good fit, it's a discussion that we need to have because it's not serving us.
Last question. Feel free to take a moment to think about it. Maybe you have a ready-made answer. Who knows? Question is, if you could take over, let's say, the screen of a person or a group of people, including the whole world, like you have someone's or some group's undivided attention for a minute, what would your message be? Why?
That is a tough one. I'm resisting an answer that's just funny. Like my instinct is to just everyone in the world sees me on their screen and I just make a funny face or something to make them smile. No deep message, and maybe that there is a deep message in that. I mean, look, I could get philosophical and say something like, be kind to each other, be more curious, all of that. But I think I'm going to go with my instinct, and I would just say or do something to make people laugh or smile, because at the end of the day, if imitating an elephant, which I can do a good job of, or making a monkey face or something, which my 4-year-old son likes, if I can just for 5 seconds make someone smile,
Certainly worked for me.
Why not?
Jimmy Carr I wanted to mention earlier, because
There you go.
he's the comedian that attempted to make shorter and shorter jokes, and there's 2 that I remembered. One was I think a 4-word joke, the stationery store moved. And the other one was he attempted a 2-word joke, which was midget shortage. So, yeah, let's leave with a laugh. And Dylan, yeah, thank you so much for your time. This was really, really helpful. If people wanted to kind of step closer in your sphere, learn more from you, you mentioned your website. Where would you point people towards? Oh, and also mention your ebook, the ebook you sent me.
Oh, yeah. So my website is my last name, Emerick-Brown.com, with the hyphen, EMERICK-Brown.com. And the ebook, which is available for free download on my website, is called Narrative Linguistics. I know, really sexy, exciting title. Writer's Workshop for Your Life. And it's basically an encapsulation of our conversation, but with very kind of a process-oriented style to it, of, the way that you can actually coach. It's like a toolkit for if you wanted to coach with that narrative in mind, you can do so. So if you're interested, download the book and enjoy it. And if you want to give me any feedback or ask any questions, I'm absolutely happy to have
Dylan, again,
continued
thank you so much. Really
conversations.
enjoyed my time here, and let's leave it here. See you around.
Thank you. Me too.